IVM.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to All Things Policy. I'm Satya and today I'm joined by my colleagues Bharath and Rijesh. Today we are exploring the key insights from the Takshashila Discussion Document on AI governance. We are the co-authors along with Sridhar Krishna, and this paper addresses a critical question. How do we govern artificial intelligence, this powerful transformative technology, to ensure that it benefits everyone and not just a few? From the control of data to the competition challenges in AI development, we will be unpacking it all over the course of a few podcasts. So whether you're a tech enthusiast, a policymaker, or just curious about the future of AI in India, this episode is for you. So Bharat and Rijesh, let's start off by talking about how and why we have structured the paper the way it is. Any inputs on that?
So the way we go about it is we talk about why we need to look at AI governance from an Indian perspective. So that includes how the current narratives around AI governance largely focus on either ethics or safety, and these are driven by different stakeholders who have skin in the game, and some of the other perspectives get missed out when the focus is solely on these things, right? So our idea here is to look at it from an Indian perspective. Is there something different that we need to look at? Are there competition issues? Is there a concern around how this impacts democracy or a stable global order? And these are the perspectives that we're trying to bring in and look at AI governance from that, I think.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, when we talk about the general AI hype that has come as a wave ever since ChatGPT was released last year, I mean, we have key Silicon Valley figures who have been on this doomerism trail, right? So they've been talking about how AI poses an existential threat to mankind, and therefore regulation should be brought in to make sure that doesn't happen. However, we are not talking about the fact that, I mean, we are talking about it, but it's getting missed under this general AI doomerism hype, right? So the problems of accountability, the problems of deploying AI before it's ready to be deployed. Who are the players in the industry who are controlling the key parts of the supply chain of AI, for instance? Right? Rijesh, any inputs on that?
Yeah. So again, I think as you were pointing out, Satya, for the most part, when people talk about AI, even doomerism, as you called it, right? It's talking about things from a sort of technical or a global perspective, saying that if there's an AGI that comes out, then there's an extinction risk, things that are at a global level. But in this document, we've kind of said, all right, if you are a nation state like India and you want to think about how AI impacts as a country, then how should we think about it, right? There may be some things that we cannot control because it's a global problem. But from an Indian perspective, what do you think about it? And that's where we've come up with two different frameworks, right? We've spoken about what a competitive supply chain for AI ought to look like as a market, whether that's global or just in India. And then what are the values that we are actually thinking of when we say how should AI work for India? So we've talked about human flourishing, that can AI help humans improve their outcomes in education, healthcare. We've talked about how AI might impact democracy. We've talked about can it have impacts on stable global orders, and how do you think about competition when there's AI underlying everything? How do you think about planetary sustainability? So those are some of the values we've kind of applied to think when we think about AI. And then we've also, of course, talked about what kind of a supply chain we think is good for the AI industry as a whole. And maybe Bharat or Satya, you can talk about a bit about the supply chain itself.
Yeah, so before we go to that, we are aware that we haven't touched upon ethical concerns or safety risks in this document. That is one area where we're trying to build capacity in the context of India. The questions of ethical concerns and safety risks are pressing concerns, of course, but the immediate and important task for AI policy is to govern the industry, we feel. This is actually what Nitin Payar, founder director and a co-author in our paper, talked about. if OpenAI and Google are really worried about the products, being dangerous and pose severe unpredictable risks to public safety, they could stop developing them, right? I'm quoting him here. So their calls for regulation are probably, partly motivated by the desire to lock in their dominant market positions. And for a developing country like India, that could, close entire industries or markets off even before it gets off the ground, or we could be completely reliant on US owned or maybe China owned technology. So
Exactly.
resilience is also something we need to take into account.
Yeah, exactly.
So let's come into the supply chain. Right? We have envisaged the AI supply chain, for lack of a better word, into 5 stages: data sources and data sets, computation, models, and application. This sorry, this applies to purpose-specific machine learning systems as well as general-purpose AI systems. So generally, when we talk about general-purpose AI systems, we are also taking into account machine learning algorithms or very specific systems. Right now, these components can be visualized as layers, with data and computation contributing to the model development, which in turn supports the applications that are built on top of it. Think about Chat GPT being an application, but AI developers using API calls to use Chat GPT for their own chatbots. So it's very specific that way. Alongside that, doing this enabled us to examine each stage from a national interest perspective and some very specific values that we'll discuss in a bit. So let's move on to why there is a need for AI governance from this perspective, and what values we're talking about.
So Satya, just like talking about why do we need to look at it from this kind of a supply chain perspective? When you look at AI as a system and you're trying to see how to govern it, you might miss the underlying the stages that go into building such a system. So if you're talking about data, data might be in silos controlled by a handful of companies. Now, if someone wants to build an AI model that's comparable to the best ones that are out there, without access to that data, you cannot really compete or build a comparable product at all. The same thing with compute, which is again there's a lot of concentration in that market. The costs are very high, and you really, without access to a cloud computing facility or access to the GPU market itself, you don't really have a chance to compete in that in build a comparable AI model. So it helps to look at these as different components so that we can look at the underlying competition issues or the concerns to these other values that we've identified, to democracy or to sustainability from at each of these stages, so that we are looking at it at a more granular level. And if there are interventions that we can identify at each stage, those are the things that we need to address, instead of looking at it at a higher level where you cannot really figure out what needs to be done at each.
Exactly.
And
I
there is
think
a
looking at it, so I think looking at it in those 5 layers has, was really helpful for us in terms of thinking through what the implications are like for each value. Like if you say that competition is a value, then is it really the case that in all layers you must have the same kind of competition, or can different layers have competition at different levels? Right. That was not a question that we would have been able to answer before we had this kind of supply chain. I think so. That the supply chain is more from the perspective of being able to apply a more narrower policy lens at each level and come up with a set of outcomes at each layer that might be useful for us, or that might be useful for India. From that perspective, it was kind of quite useful. And I just also wanted to add, there was we've also spoken about a few scenarios for the supply chain when we did it, which was interesting, and will hopefully be an interesting read for people, where we've kind of talked about what a fully integrated supply chain might look like, or what a completely disaggregated supply chain might look like. So, I mean, these are only partly fleshed out yet, I think, and there might be more research to do there. But it's an interesting start.
Yeah, so I've also encountered someone who has read the document asking me about why exactly didn't we go deeper into each stage of the supply chain. Now that the problem with that is applying a policy lens there becomes very difficult, because we'll just keep going down rabbit holes. But we have addressed certain scenarios under each stage as we go delve deeper into the document, talking about the considerations at each level of the supply chain. So we'll talk about them in a subsequent podcast. Now let's move into exactly what the values are that we use for our AI governance framework. It's not a framework per se. These are values that we want to preserve, and we have used this to examine the outcomes, desired outcomes at each stage, and whether or not we'll be able to achieve that, right? Or where the gaps or shortfalls lie. So they are human flourishing, democracy, a stable global order, competition, and planetary sustainability. So as Bharat, so then this is something we have had a lot of debate on as to what exactly counts as human flourishing. I mean, there are plenty of views elsewhere from other sectors, other areas of research as well, as to what human flourishing may count as. So can we discuss this, Bharat, Rijesh?
Yeah, so the way we're looking at it is, you know, as a developing country, we have a lot of improvement that is necessary in our education or healthcare or even accessibility to governance, right? So, and AI with its increases in productivity or cognitive capacity in augmentation that it provides, it can really help to dramatically change these outcomes. So whether it's education, where you can have access to quality education in different languages, dialects, all of that, and increase access to quality education to the remotest parts of the country. So that could be a thing. And healthcare, you can have assisted diagnosis, treatments. Now, there are obviously a lot of concerns that there might be biases in these systems. It might not be perfect. And these are things that definitely need to be addressed. But you cannot deny also the scale that it will give you in terms of reaching out to a larger number of people given our limited capacity. So, especially for a developing country, this can make a very big difference. When you consider all of these factors, right? So that's broadly how we're looking at human flourishing. Rijesh, you want to add anything to this?
Sorry, what were you saying, Satya? You were going to say something.
No, I'm just saying this, as Nitin says in his article, if AI is a superpower, it should make it accessible to everyone, right? Because of the potential to augment human development. And yes, like the concerns that exist are definitely something that need to be solved, but they are solvable. They should not be a reason for. There should be a reason for being cautious with the deployment of AI in certain areas that impact society, but that should not be a reason to stop development into the systems, especially because of the potential to transform. Rijesh, please go ahead.
Yeah, so the second value that we spoke about was democracy, and obviously the ability of an AI model or an AI system to analyze lots and lots of data uh, has tremendous potential in the area of governance, right? So there are ways in which you could think about increasing the government's effectiveness. AIs could potentially make governments more transparent. It could allow citizens to participate better in their democracies by coming up with by helping them model outcomes of policy decisions, for example, better, right? I mean, which is really not something that a normal person could do today. So AI can help democracy in those cases. I think most definitely by increasing transparency in the system, for sure. It can also increase the efficiency of government delivery of services in many areas where India definitely lags behind today, and even Bharat was pointing about in places like healthcare. But at the same time, bringing AI into governance is very, let's say, Orwellian in nature. There is always a threat of increased surveillance of citizens because of the use of AI systems. There's the concern that decision making itself might get opaque when you have AI systems making decisions. So that is obviously a concern that we must address when we talk about democracy, right? Also, I just wanted to add that it might not seem very obvious how these values play into the document or the policy we are trying to build. So, just referring back to the 5-layer supply chain that we spoke about, one way to think about it is where in the supply chain should you intervene to best enable this value to succeed. So, for example, if you say human flourishing and in education, then or let's say you want to create equality of outcomes in education and improve human flourishing, then should you intervene at the layer of data or should you intervene at the layer of model building, right? So those are the kind of questions that are kind of being enabled when we say that, okay, these are the values that we want to promote, and then use that to apply it to the supply chain. I just wanted to clarify that in case somebody is wondering.
Stay tuned to All Things Policy. We'll be right back after a short commercial break.
Right. And just on that point, I would encourage our listeners to read Weapons of Math Destruction, where what Rijesh pointed out specifically about the deployment of AI in opaque or automating processes that have clearly been meant to be led by human intervention, like let's say sentencing of prisoners. And that book really goes into detail to show how this has been deployed in the US, for instance, where just because it's opaque means that the legitimacy and trust in the system has gone down, and it has and made mistakes as well, right? And that is something we need to figure out how to deal with, balance it with the need for development of the systems, and that is something we are hoping to iterate upon as we write our next documents in this series. So the next the point, the value that you're trying to promote is a stable global order, right? So I mean, as my colleague Pranay notes in his paper on high-tech geopolitics, in a post-pandemic world, we are beginning to see, high technology and geopolitics getting increasingly intertwined. In his new book as well, I'm sorry for self-promoting Takshashila's books, but trade wars are likely to be tech wars at their core, as we begin to see the U.S. sanctions on China related to semiconductors and chip-making equipment, right? So private technology giants like Google, Amazon, Baidu, Tencent, for instance, they are expected to align more closely with the respective governments. So, if geopolitical factors will begin to influence this international tech collaboration, or a critical technology is tied to certain supply chains that are very much controlled by a few specific countries, then we need to ensure that the supply chain is diversified, right? Especially for a developing country like India, which doesn't have, as of yet, the manufacturing prowess or the trade strategic autonomy that we are talking about. So, and we haven't even begun to delve into the area of AI systems being used in military and national security applications, right? So, and this could lead to a huge imbalance of power on the global scale. Bharath or Rijesh, can you talk about competition? Why have we focused on competition specifically? I mean, this is kind of the crux of our examination of a lot of this stages of the supply chain. So, Bharath, Rijesh?
So competition, as you've seen, right? A lot of these technologies have network effects in the sense that the larger the platform that you're working on, so the larger the data that you have to work with, the better will be your predictions, the better will be your algorithm, because it's trained on such a large data set. You're likely to have better quality data also when you have access to all of these different insights that tech companies gather from users. And since we're looking at it as a supply chain, there are different stages in the supply chain, and often you see that they are vertically integrated. For example, you might think of one company controlling access to the data. You can they've invested in R&D, and they have a really a cutting edge model which is built on which is trained on a lot of data and uses a lot of compute to build that model, so on billions of parameters. And when you have all of these integrated, it's vertically integrated in that sense. It's really hard for a player without access to one of these stages to be able to compete effectively. So you need to look at competition. How do you have different options for the end users or consumers of the AI applications? How do you see that there's competition across these stages? How do you see that if someone wants to innovate, they're not restrained, there are no entry barriers as far as possible, given that there are certain market constraints in the way that the market is structured? You want to see that access is not denied because of unfair practices by any of these companies, right? So how do you promote that competition is the general idea behind this value.
Yeah, and just yeah. Just wanted to add that the competition lens, especially when you apply to each layer of that chain, right? It helps you understand where competition may or may not be possible. So it may be possible to have a very competitive market for applications, but perhaps you come to the conclusion that say compute, it is impossible to get extreme competition in compute. Then it leads to the question, okay, if we can't create a free market for compute, then what do we do? Does that mean that the state has to intervene to create its own compute infrastructure, whatever? The same thing in models. If you come to the conclusion that models are going to be, say, tightly controlled by a few global players, then what does that mean for India, right? What should we do? What are the possible next steps? So that's why competition is a very important lens. And also another question there is, maybe you come to the conclusion that, oh, as long as I can create competition in certain parts of the supply chain, then I don't really need to worry about how the rest of the chain is operating. Whether or not it is competitive is not relevant. So that is why I think this was a very interesting lens. And as you guys know, we spent, I think, the most amount of time applying this lens and using this lens across the supply chain. So
Yeah, because there are second order effects as well, right? If we begin to look at the narrative surrounding AI right now and how that's been controlled by the dominant players in the ecosystem who are creating AI systems or deploying it, there's a good chance that they can, cause regulatory capture if they move into positions of governance, or if a worldwide AI consortium, for instance, is developed. If these are the only companies or people on it, they're the ones who are going to be directing the course of development of AI, and nations will pretty much be at the mercy of their. Well, it's a little dramatic, but yeah, but at the mercy of their judgment, right? So that's something. Finally, when we're talking about planetary sustainability, this is something we also need to look at in our iterations, which is the relentless drive to build or expand the scale of AI systems has resulted in development of computationally intensive models, right? So, and computation infrastructure consume really high amounts of energy. So, in addition to carbon emissions, they also consume vast amounts of water for cooling. Like there could be water shortages, there could be clean power shortages in developing nations, for instance. Maybe the environmental impact of training or running such models should be considered in decisions regarding the governance. This is something we have to flesh out in our subsequent iterations as well. We have briefly touched upon it in the document as well. So let's talk briefly about the desired outcomes in the AI ecosystem, starting with data.
So what we try to do is, so we have a set of values that we like to see at each stage of the AI supply chain, and data being one of the key inputs to building an AI model. You need to ensure that you have access to data sets, so that the companies that want to train models are able to do so. You have diversity of data sets, so that there's issues like bias are can be addressed to the extent that it's possible. So, for example, so what we feel is that when it comes to data, portability is important. So you need, if data is locked in one data set, that's not accessible to anybody else. That's not. It could really create a problem for competition. So the ownership of that data, ideally, when it's created by an individual, there should be some way for that individual to determine how that data will be used and in what form and for what purposes. So the idea behind portability is that the individual should be able to choose that this data could be used for training other algorithms, or data that's used in say a fitness tracker should be available for that user to, say, get a healthcare provider to monitor it and provide recommendations for better health outcomes. A healthcare provider of the individual's choice, not just constrained by the options provided by the fitness tracker, for example. So these are the kind of scenarios that we are thinking about. And Rijesh, you want to add anything else here?
Yeah, so I think the key idea behind here was, that the user, the data that is created when a user interacts with networked system, right? That they are actually the owners of that data as opposed to that data belonging to whichever system created the data, right? So that is the key idea behind this segment of the document. And what we're trying to say is, what is the best way for the user to then have some control on how their data is being used? So, Bharat spoke about data portability, and that's very important. But data portability is important for the user because it prevents me from getting locked into a particular system. But it's also very important for, say, say a firm that's trying to build a model. If data becomes portable, then you might be able to think of something similar to the account aggregator framework in the financial services network. In fact, that's a great framework of how data unlocks, right? Because an account aggregator can take my financial data from multiple banks and create a single profile for me that then can then be used by some other firm to offer me services. And a similar framework as that allows data to become portable would be a great way to sort of create competition in the market, right? Because it also allows other firms to be able to compete against the large firms which have already built their silos of data. So that was another interesting thing that we were thinking about there.
So this is actually not a novel concept. It's in some sense part of the recommendations in the GDPR, where they talk about data portability. But to make that happen, you need some kind of an infrastructure which allows seamless sharing of data between, which is locked in one silo to be accessible to others, and the account aggregator framework, which is based on the data empowerment and DAPA framework. So that kind of makes it easier for this data to be accessible to different entities, unlock the value that's in those data sets. So the other recommendation that we can think of when we look at data is that data might be open data. I mean, data sets which are necessary for building a lot of the applications might be restricted to certain geographies or certain countries where they have been able to collect that data. So, for example, the UK might have an open health data set with, say, medical images that allow the algorithms to be trained on that. Now, anyone building applications for Indian healthcare applications, if they're using those data sets saying that this is the image and this was the diagnosis, and if they're trying to apply to an Indian context, it might not always yield the best results because there might be other conditions which might be pre-existing with those for in an Indian setting, or you might also have differences in the clarity of the image that's available, or in the a lot of other local challenges that you see. So it might be having local data which is representative of the population will help create applications which better address the diversity that might be there in the population.
Yeah, and a teething concern in that regard is also basically making sure that these public data sets are arranged or indexed in a particular way that allows for not portability, but basically access by different providers easily. So right now, this based on our research, we realized that a lot of public data sets are, I mean, they are in very different formats or arranged in very different databases, and that is a huge problem for anyone trying to access this. And when we move to computation, for instance, there are like two concerns. We need to ensure that competition exists because right now, as you mentioned, dominant cloud service providers like Amazon Web Services, Microsoft Azure, and Google, they are the ones controlling almost every single aspect of providing compute infrastructure. Even if there are like local players, they usually provide access to these platforms, right? And because they're vertically integrated AI supply chains. So, and this also means that competition with cloud computing customers themselves will also occur because Google and Microsoft will be deploying their own applications as well, right? So that is something that we have to look at in a market like India, where the existing industry mostly sits at the application layer, needs to be considered. So in this case, we need to look at certain outcomes which are, aside from reducing entry barriers and promoting fair competition, is also investing in building domestic capacity to participate in the global value chain for AI chips or essential computing hardware. Even the India AI report talks about this, which is creating sovereign computing resources to cater to military and government applications, and also sell time slices to industry and academia. So I mean, now there are like some practical concerns with that, but the desired outcome are as follows. Rijesh, could you talk a bit about models and the desired outcomes that we discuss here?
Sure. So, in the models piece, basically what we were thinking about is how are AI models actually developing today, right? So, if you think about it, ideally you would want a fairly competitive AI market for models, such that you can have a variety of models that serve a variety of needs. But if you look at it today, like you have the very large models, most of which like the OpenAI's ChatGPT model, Bard, Cloud. These are all proprietary models. They are the largest, trained on the largest data sets and on the largest computes. And then you have some OpenAI models like Meta's Llama and a host of other open source models, most of which have derived from Llama. What we generally would see is that proprietary models tend to be larger than the open source models. So the open source models are, say, slightly behind the curve from the proprietary models. So from an Indian perspective, if you think about it broadly if you think about it from military or dual use purposes, then there is a case to be made that yes, of course, we should build our own models and we should strive to build large models that can serve our purposes in, say, critical areas better. And we need to do whatever we need to do to build that. But in, say, commercial areas with broad research applications, maybe we don't actually need to reinvent the wheel, right? Maybe you don't actually need the most cutting edge model today for us to do some kind of access. So one way we've thought about it is, can you use grants to open source communities as a way for them to continue fine tuning and building models? I mean, again, there are two aspects to this. One is, of course, to continue to scale the size of the model, and then second is to make a model more efficient, which is what a lot of the open source community is doing, where you take an existing open source model based on Llama, for example, and you make it a little bit better by reduce the number of parameters, reduce the size of the model, and it still operates at roughly the same capability. So that's another way to do it. So we've thought about these ideas, and those are some possible outcomes. You fund open source models, you think about building your own open source models, especially in critical areas of use. And these are outcomes we still need to flesh out further what exactly that means and in which areas what applies.
Right. Let's we already done 30 minutes or so. So let's discuss the last part of our desired outcome section of the paper, which is on application. Now, application is generally where most of the AI industry in India, for instance, is concentrated, right? They're building on top of models created by OpenAI or Google, etc., or BERT, for instance. Now, the concerns here are the use and misuse of AI that could seriously maybe undermine democracy and all the values that we discussed earlier, right? Because on one hand, you have the potential to substantially increase productivity across multiple sectors, but at the same time, it can also affect transparency and efficiency within government. So there's a darker side to AI after all. Now, what are the kind of concerns that we have highlighted in this? I mean, this can range from something like AI's potential to be used to create a surveillance state, or just like spread disinformation, or deep fakes, like the current hype is around that. So, any input on that, Rijesh and Bharat?
Yeah. So again, on the application side, right? I think broadly, what I would say is as long as you can ensure, say, competition in the data set piece, right, and in the models piece of the supply chain, I think the conclusion we've arrived at is that applications should be fine. As long as an application maker is able to get access to the model and the data that they need, and they are not locked into a particular model, you can be fairly reassured that there is competition. But the other side of that, like what kind of risks might an application pose, say, to a user's data or to their rights, so on and so forth. That what we've emphasized is we've said we need like a sectoral kind of risk-based government, depending on where the application is. If it's a healthcare application, you need to have the healthcare regulator look at that application and consider what kind of regulations are necessary, what kind of access is necessary, and so on. If it's just a commercial chatbot that's trying to sell you a service, perhaps it can be light touch regulation. So this, what we've said is that you need regular stakeholder engagement. You need to look at it from a sectoral perspective. But by and large, if you can solve for competition in the other parts of the chain, the application part should be fine and should be competitive. And it should that is more than enough, I think, to serve the needs of consumers.
This is also an area where I think we're soliciting a lot more input from experts who are working on the field right now, because potential applications of AI can be something that we can overlook because we may not know that it exists. And so that's something we need to keep an eye on. Finally, I think, this suggestions are nothing new. They are what the EU and the US are also proposing, risk-based framework, but the specifics of some of those frameworks need to be tailored to the Indian context or maybe a developing nation context, because we need to balance, right, the development of the systems as well as addressing the problems and concerns that the systems bring to the fore. So I think that is it for today. And in the next podcast, we'll be delving deeper into a document where we provide insights into the AI ecosystem and highlight potential concerns that we found during our research. And finally, the list of questions that we think are necessary to answer before we can formulate an effective governance framework for AI in India. Thank you so much for joining today, Rijesh and Bharath. Hopefully, we'll get our other co-authors as well in the next podcast. And stay tuned for the next episode, everyone. Thank you very much.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.